What an amazing thing going on inside every living cell. The gentleman at the end, Dr. Kenyon, beholding the reality of what was going on within the cell, recognizing that his own theory, faced with the reality of the deep complexity, he used to believe for years and years that there had to be some random process there because there couldn't be a creator. And so his theory that some chemical attraction would bring all those things together. The more he began to look at the cell and the complexity, he realized that was impossible. And now that we understand what is really going on inside there, Dr. Kenyon recognizes and understands that this is the result of intelligent designer. That's the way we should respond. When we gaze into the box, when we gaze and see the plain evidence that God has given to us. You know, the problem is that doesn't always happen. Man doesn't always accede to the reality of what is plain to them. Dr. Francis Crick, a brilliant man, the co-discoverer of DNA, when he began to gaze into the cell and began to understand the deep complexities of what we have there. In fact, if you really want to understand how complex this issue is, it has been stated that just for the single amoeba, the information that is found within the amoeba to provide all of the DNA structure would fill 1,000 sets of Encyclopedia Britannicas. Amazing complexity. So when Dr. Francis Crick is peering into the microscope, and it is beginning to dawn on him the deep complexity of what we see here at the fundamental level of life, he becomes convinced that this could not have happened by chance. He says an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. So what does Dr. Crick do? Does he then turn to the reality of a creator? No. He then proposes a theory, a little modification of earlier theory, but his theory is directed panspermia. The theory that the first living cell must have been transported to the earth from some other planet outside our solar system. This is a brilliant man. Why does he turn to a theory like this? By the way, what's the problem with this theory?
Who created the other planet?
Where did it come from? What has he done here?
Just put the problem there.
He's just put the problem off somewhere else. Now, he recognizes that, but what is he trying to gain? What does he do by saying, well, it could not have started here because it was just so complex, so it must have come from another planet? What is he trying to gain here? Time. That's exactly right. Because he says it's impossible for this to have occurred within the billions of years here, so it must have occurred in a longer period of time somewhere else. But in the end, you can't go back far enough. You can't get enough time to come up with the complexity that we're seeing. George Wald, writing in The Origin of Life, says most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis. Now, let's stop for a second. What is the spontaneous generation hypothesis? It's a hypothesis that life springs from non-life. Now, we used to think that that was true. If you recall, we used to think, as we saw maggots grow up out of meat, that somehow life sprung from nowhere. But of course, all of our studies began to show that no, that's not true. If you put something over the top of the lid of meat, as Pasteur did, we realized that those come from fly eggs. All of that you should know. So what he's saying is this spontaneous generation theory, we understand, has been broken down. But what does he say about it? Most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis, yet unwilling to accept the alternative belief in special creation, are left with nothing. I think a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through a hypothesis of spontaneous generation. What is he saying? Well, it's just what we've been saying all along. If the evidence points outside the box, we won't go there. Although we say we will pursue the truth no matter where it leads, unless it leads to a special creation, unless it leads to a creator. And that's what Wald is saying. The scientific evidence points us there, but we will not go there. Walden says this: one has only to contemplate the magnitude of this task. To concede spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Yet here we are. As a result, I believe in spontaneous generation. And why does he believe in spontaneous generation? Because he does not want to gaze upon the face of God. Rejecting the truth. They have exchanged the truth of God for a lie. So Darwin, recall, giving us the criteria for which we could say that his theory is broken down. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. And this is exactly what has occurred. Dr. Michael Behe, in the publication of his book, Darwin's Black Box, fired a shot across the bow of the issue of evolution. And this is how he did it. Dr. Michael Behe one day was studying the complexity of the cell and turned to someone in the lab with him. And he simply asked the question, looking at all of these pieces of the cell, which we have just seen, asking the question, how could this cell exist? Could this cell exist if this piece were not there? And of course the answer was no. Well, what if this piece were not there? No. In essence, what Dr. Behe came to was the concept that he calls irreducible complexity. And he uses a mousetrap as an example of irreducible complexity. It goes something like this. He says, if you take a mousetrap, a very simple device, it only has a few parts in it. The wooden base, spring, the dinner plate, little neck breaker, and the little piece that holds the neck breaker back until an appropriate moment. Behe says, how well would the mousetrap work if one of the pieces were not there? Let's suppose that the spring were not there. The mouse would love it, but it wouldn't really work. What if, and in this mousetrap, there's just a little staple holding down one end of the rod between the spring? What would happen to the mousetrap? Well, I happen to have one of those for my house. The little staple came out. That's all that happened. Everything else is there. All the pieces are there, but the little staple that holds it in is not there anymore. How well does the mousetrap function? It does not. So Behe's argument is this. What we have discovered, the more we've opened up Darwin's black box, the cell being the black box, what we have discovered in there is the most intricate machinery. And he says, it is a machinery which is irreducibly complex. And what do we conclude? using Darwin's own criteria. To Darwin, he said the cell was a black box. Its inner workings were utterly mysterious to him. Now the black box has been opened up and we know how it works. Applying Darwin's test to the ultra-complex world of molecular machinery and cellular systems that have been discovered over the past 40 years, we can say that Darwin's theory has absolutely broken down. Now, how do we contrast that with these statements that evolutionary theory is a fact? All of a sudden now, using Darwin's own criteria to say this thing is broken down. Absolutely broken down. Let's take a look. Let's go back inside, down to the level in which we can actually begin to see the machinery and how that machinery works. That little piece that was constructed that we saw in the inner cell, that little piece taken by the machinery, now taken to a place and assembled in a larger piece of machinery, creates some of the most incredible workings within the living organism, and we're going to take a look at one called the bacteria flagellum.
Scott Minnick has studied the flagellar motor for nearly 20 years. His research has led him to challenge the co-option argument.
With the bacterial flagellum, you're talking about a machine that's got 40 structural parts. Yes, we find 10 of them are involved in another molecular machine, but the other 30 are unique. So where are you going to borrow them from? Eventually, you're going to have to account for the function of every single part as originally having some other purpose. So you can only follow that argument so far until you run into the problem of you're borrowing parts from nothing. But even if you can see that you have all the parts necessary to build one of these machines, that's only part of the problem. Maybe even more complex, I think more complex, is the assembly instructions. That is never addressed by opponents of the irreducible complexity argument.
Studies of the bacterial motor have indeed revealed an even deeper level of complexity. For its construction not only requires specific parts, but also a precise sequence of assembly.
You've got to make things at the right time. You've got to make the right number of components. You've got to assemble them in a sequential manner. You've got to be able to tell if you've assembled it properly so that you don't waste energy building a structure that's not going to be functional.
Building a molecular machine has been compared to the construction of a house, where workers follow a detailed blueprint and plan for assembly. The foundation of a house is poured before the walls are erected. Plumbing and electrical fixtures are installed prior to enclosing the walls of the structure. Windows must be hung before siding is applied, and shingles are attached only after plywood sheets are nailed to the rafters. So it is with the construction of a flagellar motor.
You build this structure from the inside out. You're counting the number of components in a ring structure of the stator, and once that's assembled, there's feedback that says, okay, no more of that component now. A rod is added, a ring is added, another rod is added, a U-joint is added. Once the U-joint's at a certain size and a certain degree of bend, about a quarter turn, that's shut off, and then you start adding components for the propeller. These are all made in a precise sequence, just like you would build a building.
To build a motor correctly requires a complex system of machines that coordinate the timing of the assembly instructions. But how could natural selection construct such a system?
The co-option argument doesn't explain this. You see, in order to construct that flagellar mechanism, or tens of thousands of other